poor experience, showed empathy in the questions that were being asked and the follow-up questions. So much of the impact of this was that the individual actually commented, "I appreciate you showing me empathy. I love working with an organization like this." And so these conversational AI capabilities can really improve the relationship, which I think is what every organization is trying to do.
Hmm. But basically, it is really the AI generated conversation. The computer is having this conversation. A human being is not.
That is right. And so, let's talk about, getting high quality data. With surveys, there's a level of data that you can get. And if you compare that to, for example, with a 5-minute personal interview that would be done by a human, of course, you're going to get a lot more data in the interview because the human will adjust to ask more questions to get down to, okay, what makes this actionable? Well, we automate all that through conversational AI, through generative AI. And so, yes, it is the generative AI having the conversation, but we can, for example, train the AI to have the tone of the company, to understand what rewards can be given. And you think about where this will head. You can see where, as an organization is conducting a survey and there's a poor experience, the system will automatically be able to close the loop and say, "Oh, we apologize about this. Hey, here are some points. Here is a gift certificate to come back on us." And you can have all that be controlled based upon the feedback that is being given. And to the point that Fred made earlier, the best measurement of are you doing the right things is, are you closing the loop? And so you can see where this conversational AI is going to take us to where we can close the loop in the moment when that feedback is being given.
But if personal customer experience is so important and a customer feeling like they are important, it would seem that we're not at a point yet where but perhaps with your response from the person who went to the patient who went to the hospital and felt that the AI conversation was empathetic. Perhaps I'm not right here, but it would seem that we're not at a point yet where we could use AI to be authentic enough to create a personal experience for a customer. But you think we're almost there, or we are there? What would you say, Brad?
Yeah, we're definitely on the path there. There's a lot of conversation in the industry right now about agentic AI, and that really is the next frontier. And what agentic AI is autonomous agents that have been trained to understand the customer experience, that have been trained to understand the organization, their brand, their tone. And so as I think out the next 2 to 3 years, as these agentic solutions come out, you'll see a lot more of exactly what you were saying, of where you will have agents who will be able to take action on behalf of customers. And so as I fast forward 2 or 3 years from now, you'll start seeing things rather than an individual coming to a website or in an app and then, navigating that to accomplish something. They'll be able to come up to that app or website and just describe what it is that they want or what they're trying to accomplish. And then you'll have a set of autonomous agentic AI that's operating in the background, these agents, to take that action. And our belief is you want to infuse all those agents with an understanding of the human experience, which is where our investments have been for the last 5 years. Yes, we continue to improve surveys, but all the investments, the majority of the investments has been in how do we build the AI to understand the human experience, to then allow organizations in these systems like an NPS system to be able to understand what the lived experience of the customer and the employee was and then take action.
Okay, 30 seconds left. I know, Fred, there's a lot there, but we're going to give you the last word here. We have come a long way from developing the question, would you recommend us to a friend, it seems.
Brad started out saying that Qualtrics analyzed 1.2 billion responses, at a 1% response rate. That, I don't know, you're and I don't know what market share Qualtrics has of the market. It's very substantial, but it means there's hundreds of billions, maybe 1 trillion responses or requests for survey. There's a problem out there. The tragedy of the commons is upon us. I think we need to simplify. Yes, AI can help, but my simplification is even simpler. The real goal is to treat a customer so well that they come back for more, and especially they refer their friends.
Okay.
Don't ask them a survey.
Thank you, Fred.
Ask them if they refer.
Thanks, Fred. I'm Deborah Becker. This is On Point.
On Point is a production of WBUR Boston and is distributed by APM, American Public Media.
Support for On Point comes from the listeners of WBUR Boston and from the Music Emporium, guitar sellers for more than 50 years, celebrating the enduring presence of music made on the front porch and center stage. You can learn more at themusicemporium.com. And BetterHelp, committed to helping clients with issues ranging from relationship challenges and goal setting to grief and depression. Learn more at betterhelp.com/public.
This is KUOW FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham. Well, it's almost noon on a Friday. That means it's almost time for KUOW's Week in Review. Here's today's host, Mike Lewis.
Thanks, Bernard. Lot of new things to discuss on the show today. A new legislative session got underway this week. We will see what new rules are on things like rent, parking, flavored tobacco, and nicotine products in Washington this year. We also have a new governor. How did the old one do when on his way out? And what is the new governor, Governor Ferguson, going to be doing that's different from the old? And we will look at new housing ideas in SoDo. Been a conflict in this town for quite a while. We'll discuss a new version of an old debate on the show today, plus something to smile about. All coming up.
42 degrees in South Seattle, where we expect a high of 44, mostly sunny this afternoon. Overnight, partly cloudy with a low of 31. We will dip down just under the freezing mark. Tomorrow, Saturday, sunny with a high of 42. Sunday, same thing, sunny, high of 42.
Support for KUOW comes from Finney Ridge Painting, dedicated to quality workmanship and attention to detail. Now booking winter interior painting and carpentry projects, along with pre-booking 2025 exterior projects. FinneyRidgePainting.com, professional painting with a personal touch. And from Forecast Coffee, partnering with farms that practice agroforestry and donating a portion of their profits to reforestation efforts. Available at PCC community markets and other local retailers. Home delivery options at forecastcoffeecompany.com.
Ever wonder what fossils can tell us about a dinosaur fight?
Or what spiders and astronauts have in common?
Then you gotta listen to Spectacular Specimens,
KUOW's new podcast for kids and adults.
In each episode, we'll visit the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture
to learn about one of their fascinating specimens.
Listen to the first 3 episodes on the KUOW app
or wherever you get your podcasts.
Starting January 21st.
Live from NPR News, I'm Lakshmi Singh. The Supreme Court's upholding a federal law to ban TikTok as of Sunday if the short-form video sharing app used by 170 million people in the U.S. alone fails to divest itself of Chinese ownership. The U.S. says it is concerned the Chinese government could exploit TikTok to gain sensitive information from American users. Hours before the court decision, President-elect Donald Trump said he and Chinese leader Xi Jinping talked by phone about TikTok, as well as illegal fentanyl trafficking and the ongoing U.S.-China trade dispute. The Biden administration has announced more medications that will be targeted for lower prices under Medicare. NPR's Sydney Lupkin reports negotiating drug prices in Medicare is a new power that was created by Biden's Inflation Reduction Act.
The federal government and the pharmaceuticals industry are about to go head-to-head once again. In its last full weekday in office, the Biden administration has named the next 15 drugs up for price negotiation in Medicare. Ozempic is on the list. The type 2 diabetes blockbuster drug is joined by its obesity drug cousin, Wegovy, as well as drugs for various cancers, asthma, psoriasis, and bipolar disorder. The government can't pick just any drugs in Medicare. There are certain rules laid out in the Inflation Reduction Act that say which drugs are eligible. The negotiations will take place in the coming months. Sydney Lupkin, NPR News.
European Union regulators are expanding their probe into the workings of X, the social media platform owned by Elon Musk. From Brussels, Terry Schultz reports the new questions are about X's compliance with EU rules on content moderation.
The European Commission, the EU's executive arm, is asking X for more details on its system of recommending online content to users. X is suspected of manipulating algorithms to give higher visibility to far-right messages. EU Commission spokesman Thomas Renier says the company has been asked to preserve all data related to any recent changes in the recommender system, to share measurements on post popularity, and to hand over all relevant internal documents by February 15th.
This will help us in our fact-finding on content moderation and virality of accounts.
The investigation was opened in December 2023 into whether X's practices comply with the Blog's Digital Services Act, which regulates how big platforms manage illegal content and information manipulation. For NPR News, I'm Terry Schultz in Brussels.
Ohio Governor Mike DeWine's chosen as lieutenant governor to fill the seat vacated by Vice President-elect J.D. Vance.
Lieutenant Governor John Houston. I have worked with him. I have seen him. I know his knowledge of Ohio. I know his heart. I know what he cares about. I know his skills.
Houston and fellow Ohioan Bernie Moreno, who was elected to the Senate in November, will both be part of the freshman class of the 119th Congress. You're listening to NPR News.
This is KUOW News. I'm Paige Browning with our top stories. Health officials in King County say someone with a confirmed case of measles who was likely infectious traveled through SeaTac Airport January 10th. They say the person is an Alaska resident and was likely exposed to measles while abroad, though their vaccination status is unknown. Before being diagnosed, they passed through the S-Concourse International Arrivals, Customs, and Baggage Claim. Officials say the risk to the public is low since most people are vaccinated, but anyone in those areas, January 10th, should check their vaccination status. Labor, immigrant, and prison advocates are urging the new Washington state legislature to speed up the pardons process for immigrants with criminal records. KUOW's Gustavo Segrero reports.
When he was convicted in connection to a robbery at 18, Manny Uch got into more trouble than just local or state courts. Because he was a refugee from Cambodia, that also got him a deportation order when he finished serving his time. But then a governor pardoned him in 2009. That helped him stay in the U.S. Now, a citizen in his late 40s, he's working to help others like him.
We might make poor choices when we were younger, but we're adults now, and life changed, life moved. We moved on from our past.
The coalition is calling on the governor and the attorney general for blanket pardons for hundreds of refugees and immigrants. That could include someone with older convictions or one that a court has already dismissed. The group is warning the focus of Trump's mass deportation promises means people in this situation who've already served their time will be the first to be targeted. Gustavo Segrero, KUOW News.
For people who travel by Sound Transit Light Rail, 5 stations between Capitol Hill and SoDo will close for construction work tonight through Monday morning. Shuttle buses will run between the stations, but they're expected to be impacted by road closures for tomorrow's Women's March through downtown. Be sure to check Sound Transit for updates. This is KUOW.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Made in Cookware. Made in Cookware is crafted by chefs for chefs and designed for restaurants and home kitchens around the world. Their cookware can be found at madeincookware.com.
Welcome to Friday and welcome to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Mike Lewis. For the next hour, we'll be discussing what happened this week with, first up, Ryan Packer, contributing editor with The Urbanist. Welcome, Ryan.
Thanks for having me.
I think this is your first time on the show, correct?
It's my first time.
Awesome. We're looking forward to it. Of course, returning is Randy Pepple, Republican strategist and media commentator. Good to see you again, Randy.
Thank you very much.
And KUOW's own Scott Greenstone, politics and policy reporter and co-host of the Sound Politics podcast. Scott, we've spent years now, 1 or 2 degrees of separation. It's nice to finally be in the same room.
Happy Friday. Thanks for having me.
I'm Mike Lewis, the outlet store version of Bill Radke. You can find us live and in VistaVision on YouTube. Just search KUOW. For the next hour, we're going to embark on a news journey that will take us through statewide discussion of rent stabilization, or is that called control, a potential ban on candy-infused vape juice. How many of you anticipated ever putting that phrase together? A secret plan revealing the blockbuster news that Washington state Democrats might indeed be tax curious in 2025, and the legacy of the outgoing governor and plans for his replacement. And remember, panelists, We are going to be asking you for one thing, just one, that made you smile in the past week. Let's get on with the show. On rent control, something Democrats call rent stabilization and the GOP calls rent control, and the Washington State Supreme Court has consistently called illegal, is on the agenda of state Democrats in the upcoming legislative session. Rapidly rising rents in Washington State, particularly in the Puget Sound, is the top of the list for the next legislative session. In the form of House Bill 1217, state Democrats would like to cap rent increases statewide at 7% annually while not allowing any rent hike in a renter's first year in a building. Some estimates with Zillow and other real estate trackers have shown an average of 40% rent increases over the past 10 years, but a majority won't alone do the trick. A 1981 Washington law and subsequent Washington State Supreme Court decisions have effectively banned rent caps and have thwarted rent stabilization or control efforts in the past. Randy, we're starting with you. How does the GOP see this one?
Well, this is a real easy one for those of us on the market side. It's rent control in this bill indicates Democrats are not serious about housing affordability. They've been talking about that as one of their major issues for this session. But basic supply and demand indicates that rent control will do for prices. It will send them up. And the left is admitting that by the fact they won't call it rent control. They say this is rent stabilization when the government tells the private sector what they can do. That's not control. That's just stabilization. I mean, the fact they can't even tell the truth about their own proposal indicates the problems they have with it. And I think that as the session goes forward and they have to defend the position that we are going to make housing more expensive so that we can talk about housing affordability, I think they're going to have problems with that.
Ryan?
Let's be clear about the label here. So they're calling rent stabilization different from rent control because unlike a New York City style rent control system, landlords would be able to charge whatever they like between tenants. They just couldn't charge over 7% more per year to an existing tenant. So if you're paying $2,000 a month for an apartment, you couldn't increase the rent by more than $140 a year. And so that's different than a strict cap, which basically keeps rents low on a building forever.
I really like calling it rent limits or rent hike limits. I don't know if that feels more true, but whatever you want to call it, legislation to pass it has gotten closer every year. Last year, it was just a few Senate Democrats who spoke out against it and tanked the legislation. Those folks are mostly gone now. They ran for higher office. They failed. I think the progressives who want to pass this, they think they might have an ally in the new governor, Bob Ferguson. He's been, he said he's open to it, I think, roughly. I do think there's a question of if this proposal is popular with the general election voters, because in California, also a blue state, maybe not as blue as us, they killed it with a huge margin in last November's election. I think it was 60-40. And that was a similar thing to what's been proposed here, just removing a constitutional cap on rent.
So what happens here regarding the legality of it? I mean, there have been challenges in the past to any form of rent cap, rent stabilization. Is this one inoculated against some sort of legal challenge?
Well, I think with the current state Supreme Court's willingness to overturn precedent and willingness to be far more political than legalistic, I don't think they're worried about that. I think that there are elected officials even remaining in the Democrat caucus, although far fewer than last year, as Scott pointed out. There are people who are going, this will make housing more expensive. This will not help us get reelected. And it's putting that doubt into their mind that's the only thing that's going to derail this, because the progressives in Seattle have no problem with making rent more expensive. They don't care about that. They think this is their issue and they can pursue it, but it is counterproductive to everything else that other Democrats are saying about housing affordability, including the new governor.
Well, let me follow up on that for just a moment, though. What would be your advice to a GOP minority? How do you fight this?
You just point out the Democrats want to control how much the private sector can charge for rents. The Democrats want to control how much the private sector can charge for X. All you have to point out, if you're the Republicans, is once again, the Democrats are saying government knows the answer. And if you think government's doing great, by all means, support this. If you think government is not doing so great, then you have to ask, why should they be in charge of setting rents?
But Randy, I'm wondering, what is the Republican response to the problem as far as rent limits goes? I mean, rents are really high, especially in places like Seattle. Some of that is because housing, supply is not where it, should be. But how do you stop a landlord from just, even doing what folks are doing in LA right now, right? The price gouging because of the lack of supply.
The lack of supply is something the Democrats have baked into the system because they've been running the state for the last 30 years. And they have increased regulatory control over housing development, over condo development, and otherwise that have made it have made it very unprofitable to provide the type of supply that we need. Limit some of that, and that's what the new governor has said with one of his executive orders. Let's come in and go, let's get rid of some of these government regulations that are holding up housing affordability and housing production. And the fact is, after 30 years of Democrat control, why do we have to say that now? I mean, my God, this problem has been out there, and Democrats have ignored it for years, and their answer is, let's have government be in charge of it.
I think that's what's different this year. The legislature has been doing some big things over the past couple of years. You may have heard about a bill called HB 1110, which basically bans single-family housing in the state. Now they're basically saying that we can't have rent stabilization without substantive overhauls of the land use regulations. There's likely going to be a transit-oriented development bill that allows apartment buildings around major transit stops. There's a bunch of other smaller bills that are going to potentially have a big impact, and so it's being paired with that. It's not saying we have to have rent stabilization, but we can't have more supply.
Let me ask you, Randy, one question about this, because I think to Ryan's point, how does do you see the GOP reacting to elements of this from a housing supply standpoint? Increased density, some stuff that the GOP has opposed in the past, increased density. What is that a component here? I mean, is there room to negotiate on this one, or is this something that you feel like from a GOP standpoint, it is a non-starter?
Well, I think there's always room for negotiation and compromise. I mean, otherwise you're not going to get anything done unless you're in 100% society.
Right.
So I absolutely believe there is that room. However, when you start from the idea that Democrats are espousing that the government needs to control the costs of private sector activity, Republicans have a problem with that because government hasn't shown an ability to control itself, let alone to control the private sector in a productive way. And so I think Republicans have to keep pointing out, if you want more supply, then allow us to build. Reduce the regulatory burdens that you put on, the cost burdens you put on new construction. As Ryan points out, they're pairing it with other incentives. Guess what? Why don't you just put the incentives out there first and see where you get on supply? Because that is what's been lacking in our state.
So, Ryan, let me move to an issue that you're pretty familiar with, and it related to the same thing. There's a push to cap parking spot ratios on new developments to promote more home building, increased density, a deeper reliance on transit. Senate Bill 5184 would cap most housing development parking ratios at one stall for every new house or new apartment statewide. That's a very sort of basic description. What else would this legislation do, Ryan?
Well, it would one thing that it would do would be remove a requirement that new bars and restaurants that serve alcohol be required to build parking stalls, which is kind of a wild thing when you consider our.
I literally had no idea that was in law right now.
Yeah. And so it's basically reforming our very outdated rules around if you build a new building, you have to include a certain number of parking stalls. The city of SeaTac has a requirement that every new hospital you build has to have one parking stall for every bed and also 5 stalls for every 2 employees.
I think what's really interesting to me about this proposal, it seems like I'm curious to see if some Republicans sign on, because it does seem, on paper at least, like another one of those things where urbanists and free market Republicans kind of agree that we need more housing. We should be removing the regulations that keep us from housing, but from building housing. But I wonder though, when the state takes control of a situation and says, hey, cities, you can't do this anymore. It does come up against a bipartisan idea, kind of an older idea in Washington state, that the cities should be able to say what goes on, within their borders. And the cities don't answer to free market ideas or high, urbanist supply side, like lofty philosophies. They answer to often the folks who come to a city council hearing at 9 a.m., drive there and say, I can't find parking on my street anymore. I've lived here for 30 years. What are you going to do about it? So it'll be interesting to see.
Randy, so is there, to Scott's point, is there room? Is there room for it?
I absolutely think there's room, but think about the cities that have this problem, that have a parking problem. They are all represented in 100% by Democrats in the state of Washington. I mean, in our urban areas, in Seattle, in Tacoma, in Spokane, the places where you might have a parking problem, those are all represented by all Democrats. This is a Democrat on Democrat fight. Republicans are willing, I think, to look at lifting regulatory burdens to allow greater housing. Parking is not the top issue there. The top issue is access to natural gas. The top issue is energy. The top issue is electricity. It is not parking.
I would disagree. You're not seeing what you're not seeing in rural areas where you're basically requiring every building to have parking stalls, and so you don't see sort of proposals that can't pencil out. There are examples in the rural parts of our state, smaller towns where buildings just aren't feasible, especially sort of in the old cores of our, the areas of our rural cities that are still kind of walkable. You're basically continuing to, snuff out projects that are in inception because of these onerous parking requirements.
Scott, so from what I've been reading, and certainly conversations that I've had, the developer community seems to be kind of interested in this. I mean, to some degree, because they've always complained about the number of parking requirements, and that makes buildings more expensive. I mean, there's no question about it. Do you see some area here that is compatible between both sides, the folks who want to increase the amount of housing and the folks who want to decrease the cost of building that housing?
Oh man, this is Ryan knows way more about this than I do. I think developers want to make money. They want projects to pencil out. I don't know. I'm going to take your question. I'm going to catch it and I'm going to lob it over to Ryan.
Perfect.
So when Seattle basically allowed developers to not have to include a certain number of parking stalls around transit in 2012, 70% of new buildings still had parking. But what happened was you basically encouraged the production of close to 36,000 new apartments that were able to take advantage of the new rules, allowing them to build less parking. That's 10% of our existing housing stock.
I the last thing I'll say is I don't own a car. I'm one of the 1 in 5 Seattleites who does not have access to a car. We're one of the top 10 cities in the nation where people
have been for 20 years now.
But this panel is 50% that, so I don't have a car either.
But I did. I'm borrowing my friend's car, and I had to find parking on my street today in Beacon Hill, and it was tough. I was getting into the mindset. I was like, okay, all right, I get it. Yeah, where's my parking spot?
All right, so Randy, the GOP comes to you and says, how do we handle this issue? Do you say at some point, hey, there is actually room on this discrete issue for both sides to work together?
Frankly, I'd say that on more than just this discrete issue, but look for the areas that serve your constituents. And as you say, in Seattle, it's now 1 in 5
let me push
people.
Back on that. We'll push back on that a little bit. The areas that serve their constituents drive to Seattle and try to park here. There's a whole bunch of football fans I know on weekends and hockey fans who come in. So they are actually carrying the burden of available parking.
They
and
actually
not available parking.
they park in my neighborhood, and then I can't find
Yeah,
it because they get on the light rail.
But the parking there, I think what you're talking about here is major developments have to have, by government requirement, certain amount and types of parking. I would argue Republicans should be able to go, you know what, we can get rid of almost all of that. Let the developers figure it out. If government isn't going to punish you for not providing parking, they'll try to provide as much parking as is possible, but they'll try to maximize the buildable space. So I think from a Republican standpoint, parking minimums are not your problem. The bigger problem is the Democrat propensity to try to link that with, we're trying to push you onto mass transit. That's where Republicans start to have problems saying, don't punish people with cars. You don't have to reward them for having it, but don't punish them for it. And I think that's where you're going to get the dynamic of where Republicans would jump off of this type of proposal.
All right, well, let's move on then to flavored vaping. Vaping reformists, I guess that's a new term. Vaping reformists say candy and fruit-flavored vape juice lures in young people and increases addiction. They want to ban it in Washington State, any flavored tobacco and nicotine products. Chris Reichdahl, the state school superintendent, supports this. Critics have said the state would lose money and people might turn back to smoking tobacco. Scott, I'm going to go with you on this one. Is there a political divide on this in Olympia, or is this something that is kind of universally agreed upon that maybe the state should do some sort of narrowing of what's available in terms of vape?
That's a great question. It's something I'm gonna be keeping my eyes on. I do want to say, just for the record, it's not just vape juice. It's the draft proposal that I looked at. Would also ban sales of menthol cigarettes, flavored nicotine pouches like Zins, not all Zins, but just flavored Zins, clove cigarettes, things like that. So, it's going to be.
How are people going to?
That's where this
That's going to kill all the goth clubs in the region.
That's why this has faltered in the past. Is you want to stop kids from smoking. And the best way to do that is to stop them from starting. So what's the tobacco industry do? They try to get them started sooner, and so they bring candy elements in or what have you. But when you try to draft the regulation to deal with that, you touch menthol. And that is something that more adults prefer in cigarettes. And therefore, that has stopped these proposals in the back, because then all of a sudden adults start going, hold on just a second. You want to cut down on the kids doing that, that's fine. Menthol, cloves, those are not generally the elements that kids are looking for, but those are elements that adults who smoke prefer. And that's what's killed these proposals in the past.
Ryan, do you buy into the idea that flavored vape juice lures in young vapors, or flavored tobacco products lures in young people?
I do buy that argument. I do think that there could be something to be said about the menthol and clove cigarettes. But we've known for a long time how addictive these products are. We don't let people market similar products to kids. That seems pretty cut and dry to me.
There's part of the proposal also that says it's not just flavors. The other thing is, apparently, I learned this in the course of reporting this story, that some vape, not the cartridges, but the machines themselves, they have video games built into them. And that also, sort of seems, this proposal would ban that as well. That seems like, potentially, an easy, a place for some people to agree. Some people who want to ban sales.
All right, quick lightning question, just yes or no. If fruity flavors lure young people in, is the opposite also true? Should we mandate vape juice only come in turnip or sneaker insole flavors?
Not as long as adults are buying them. They have more choice than children.
Ryan,
is there a Werther's original flavor available?
Scott.
We laugh, but a lot of folks, when Jay Insley tried to, sorry to be serious about this part, when Jay Insley offered an emergency, put through an emergency order when there was some mysterious lung disease working its way through, folks showed up at public comment for the Board of Health and said, this stuff saved my life. These vapes saved my life. This was not just related to flavors, but people care about this stuff.
Yeah, that's true. And actually, that's always been the sort of the serious end of the argument, is that vaping has gotten more people off smoking tobacco, and there is a public health benefit to that. All right, we're going to roll through the last issue here really quickly. Seattle Democrat Nicole Frame accidentally gifted the House GOP members the Democrats' super secret tax plan, complete with talking points. I guess we're going to start with you on this one, Randy. Do you see, was there a benefit to the Republicans getting a glimpse into, first off, what did the plan say? And secondly, was there a benefit to the GOP of getting an early view of this?
The main benefit was the talking points, because they were just so ridiculous. Just like the Democrats saying, we need to identify a villain. Let's not talk about taxing the rich, but let's identify the villain.
That was so interesting.
And, talking about it in very strict messaging terms, as opposed to policy terms, which undercuts the Democrats' argument on, on policy, we're looking to balance the budget in the most efficient and effective way. No, we're looking for villains. And so that's the advantage the Republicans get from that. They knew the Democrats were going to come out with taxes. They've done it in every budget ever. So they're going to do that.
I thought that was so fascinating what you're bringing up. It was this slide that said, don't say, it was like a do say this, don't say this. And it said, don't say tax the rich or pay their fair share. Taxes aren't a punishment. And it just struck me as it's the most Democrat coded thing I've ever read, because these folks are so scared of looking like populists. What they have is a Washington state that apparently has turned around on taxing the rich. 12 years ago or 15 years ago, there was a similar proposal that would, it was a much bigger proposal. It would tax people who make more than $200K. Died in a fire. It was like a third of people voted for it. Post Occupy Wall Street, post the pandemic, we now have an electorate that seems very open to taxing at least richer folks. And yet they're all like, don't say tax the rich. I just think it's so...
Don't use the words.
It's so funny to me. Pay their fair share is what you should say instead.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Week in Review.
It's 43 degrees in South Seattle. The forecast is for sun this afternoon and a high of 44. KUOW 94.9, Seattle's NPR news station. It's 12:30.
Support for KUOW comes from the Washington State Department of Revenue's Unclaimed Property Program, currently holding $2.4 billion in uncashed checks, insurance proceeds, forgotten deposits, and more for Washington residents and businesses. Learn more at claimyourcash.org.
And from Purpose Dignity Action, working with partners in human services, law enforcement, and local government, PDA designs and implements solutions to help neighborhood public safety challenges, offering stabilization and recovery for people with complex needs. Learn more or donate at wearepda.org.
Welcome back to KUOW's Week in Review. With us are Randy Pepple, Republican strategist and media commentator, Ryan Packer, contributing editor with The Urbanist, and KUOW's own Scott Greenstone. I'm Mike Lewis, filling in for Bill Radke. So one of the biggest events of the new year is the change after 12 years, the change in administration in Olympia. Former Governor Jay Inslee is out. We're going to talk about him first. Bob Ferguson, former AG, Bob Ferguson is in, but let's start with Jay Inslee. We've got a whole swath of things that happened during his 12 years, from the environment, the homeless, the COVID pandemic, deficit, public safety issues, to the group. And Randy, this includes you. You're going to have to contribute to this section. What would you call Inslee's biggest achievements of his extended tour as governor of Washington?
Well, not unsurprisingly, I would say his biggest achievement is his Trump-like ability to ignore basic facts and data and declare victory for whatever he's done. I mean, as listeners would know, I ran Rob McKenna's campaign against Jay Inslee. I actually ran a couple of congressional races against Jay Inslee earlier in life. So I've been involved in campaigns with Jay for over 30 years. And it's just his Zen-like ability to ignore reality and portray everything as happy and good because of what he's decided has continued all the way to the end. And I would say, I think it's a shame that the press has not taken a much closer look at his claims of success and whether they were actually success. Because frankly, every data point you look at the Inslee administration has failed. Homelessness is up. Carbon emissions are up. Crime is up. The inflation is up. Gas prices are up. Overall energy is up. All of these failures on his part. And Jay Inslee's walking out the door saying, oh, I did great because the electorate voted after we outspent the other side 50-1 on TV and didn't tell the truth about my policies, but we're all good.
I think it's important to look at what the voters said when we're talking about Inslee's crowning achievements, because, tying with Republican Governor Dan Evans for longest tenure is no small
no small thing.
No small thing. It would be hard for a Democrat to lose in this state now today, but at the same time, last year, the Climate Commitment Act, something that Inslee championed, the capital gains tax that certainly he waved through. A number of his policies, voters are saying resoundingly, yes, we like this. I think that will be, I don't know if time will tell, do people think he was really the climate champion that he has styled himself to be? But I do think the results are clear. The election results are there. People seem to like what he did.
Ryan?
I would say his successes are definitely the focus on the climate. I'm actually going to go back to an issue you just said is a failure, which is homelessness. And I'm going to say there's been some big changes that are going to benefit the state in the long term. Obviously a lot of cities kind of have a major homelessness issue, but state highways and overpasses are where people go to sleep a lot of the time. And so the state came in and looked at what Seattle has done for years in terms of sweeping people from one place to another and said, we're going to do this differently. We're going to do this called the Right of Way Initiative. And we're going to actually ensure that people get housing, permanent supportive housing, housing options. And it's been a lot more successful than the model in Seattle.
Ryan, how dare you? You preempted one of my failures by saying it was a success first before I could say the failure part.
All right, so that's a fair summation of what you see as the crowning achievements. Let's just, Scott, then you've sort of set the table. Let's talk about failures.
Well, big picture on homelessness, when he took over, when Inslee took over in 2013, we had the 6th highest homelessness in the nation. It's almost doubled. We're now 4th highest. The nation's homelessness has risen too, but the county and the city asked Inslee for help nearly a decade ago. And I think that so I think that is something. But the other thing that I think of, the thing I think he might actually agree with me on as one of his biggest failures, is early in his tenure, he and the legislature gave Boeing the biggest tax break a state had ever given a corporation, which was later revealed to be even larger, hundreds of millions in tax breaks, in the hopes that they would not only keep jobs here, but hire more and more people over time. And if you haven't been reading the news at all, that did not happen. The opposite has happened. Yeah. So that would be a big, and he admitted that on the Daily Show when he was running for president. But I think he would agree with me that that's one of his biggest failures.
So Randy, while your achievements list sounded to me like a failures list, let's go into your failures list.
The failure list is relatively straightforward. It's our budget. Jay Inslee has doubled state spending in his time in office. Our state budget is more than twice what it was when he got in. And with all of that economic activity, with all of that money flowing in, he's leaving the state with a $10 billion deficit, because they couldn't even manage a massively growing economy. His willingness to give state taxpayer dollars to his campaign donors has been stunning. And on the way out the door, another huge tax increase for state employees that the state cannot afford, and yet Jay Inslee has negotiated that and said, oh, we absolutely have to have it. At some point, the state needs to spend just a little bit less than it's taking in. More money is coming into the state. It's not like the state is receiving less money. It just continues to spend more than it gets. And Jay Inslee wasted this huge economic growth opportunity to really set the state on a stage for continued success by investing in the type of infrastructure improvements that we need. And instead, he has just frittered it away and destroyed the economy.
Ryan, let me ask you a question on specific to Inslee's term. Despite vaccines, COVID-19 still has the power to infect state legislative initiatives. And while it seemed like distancing and working at home and closing communal businesses, bars, coffee shops, things like that, statistically helped curb the infection rate, it doesn't appear that the same was true with school closures. Do you feel like Jay Inslee overreached during the pandemic, or did he respond in a manner that he didn't have a choice because none of us really knew the whole breadth of what was going on?
I think overall, if you think that we overreacted to COVID, I don't think that you're prepared for the next pandemic. Personally, is how I view that. Obviously, in retrospect, some of the school closures we might not have gone as hard as we did, but that was in retrospect, and so we didn't really know the full extent of how bad this was, and so that's my view in terms of supposed overreach. I think you really need to have a leader who's ready to take strong, bold action.
I do think, minds and being together, community, mental health, obviously that's all very important. Living is very important too. And I do think history will probably see Inslee somewhat favorably on this point, simply because our COVID rates are some of the best in the country. They're up there with island states like Hawaii. And they were, in 2020, Alaska was up there with us. And then 2021 rolled around and they dove. They took a dive when they opened, among other things, opened their schools. So I think this is something, even though I do think Bob Ferguson, now we see this new governor, he is open to reforming the governor's emergency powers. So there's certainly Republicans had a point about maybe him going too far, or at least Ferguson thinks so.
Let's go into that just a little bit further. Is there likely to be some sort of bipartisan effort to curb executive power with the governor's office? Anyone?
The governor has said he wants to see it, and he has cited a Republican bill. Democrats have spent the last 4 years denying that there was any problem, so go away. I don't think the Democrats in the legislature really want to give the Republicans a victory on this, and so they're unlikely to do so. And that is the biggest problem of Jay's overreach, and I would disagree with Ryan on that. He maintained emergency powers over the state for over 2 years. That was just criminal. There was no reason for it other than his own arrogance. And the learning loss of students, again, I would disagree with Ryan. We did know in real time what that was doing to students. One, they were the least likely to get COVID, so the fact that they were the ones that were being told not to go to school is a real problem. That was a teachers' union payoff by Jay Inslee. The teachers union told him not to open the schools, so he didn't. And that was wrong. And, that's why now are Democrats going to say, oh, we want to admit that Jay was wrong? That admits we were wrong. So I don't think the legislature is going to give in to Bob Ferguson on that one, even though we need to have the Emergency Powers Act overwritten because it lends itself to abuse by Republican or Democrat.
Since Jay is no longer governor, can't they freely admit that maybe he was not right on it? I mean, at this point, especially with Bob Ferguson
they can
saying
freely
that
admit that,
maybe this is a possibility.
But they can freely admit that, but then they have to freely admit I was wrong and I was just protecting him out of partisan reasons. And a lot of Democrats don't want to admit that they were just protecting Jay for partisan reasons, and that's what they were doing.
Ryan, let me ask you to sort of set up, because Randy brought up the fact that Bob Ferguson, now Governor Bob Ferguson, is perhaps warm to the idea of some sort of limit on executive power. But that also brings us to what his agenda is. He has said that he wants a cut state budget, that he has sort of pushed back a little bit on Democrats' plan. Now we know what the tax plan is. Apparently he might have known that in advance. How do you see Ferguson's administration differentiating itself from Jay Inslee's?
Well, so far, we definitely have seen a bit of a swerve into the moderation lane, asking for a 6% cut across all agencies. before he's even taken office is kind of a huge signal in terms of what he kind of wants to see. We haven't seen any details on that. It's not really a budget proposal. It's really more of a piece of paper. And
Right.
so, but I think people are kind of a little bit interested to see that this is going to be such a departure from the person he served under for so long as Attorney General. I think that's very interesting, but we don't have a whole lot of other clues about sort of what his priorities really are going to be.
It's really
Scott?
interesting. Yeah. Ferguson was the warm-up guy for Inslee when Inslee was running for governor and Bob was running for Attorney General. So to see them with so much tension, but if I were Bob, I can see why I might be upset at Jay, because he is leaving me with these giant budget holes. I think progressives were really surprised by that speech. I think if you had been listening to Ferguson or forced Ferguson to talk more about, they very much kind of blindly followed him all through last year because there was no other, there were no other progressive challengers. They didn't really pay attention to when he said things like, I'm a fiscal hawk, they seem to have closed their eyes when he plastered the TV with stuff about spending $100 million to hire more cops. So I think they're surprised now. I think he may have gotten off on the wrong foot with his own party, which is going to be a problem because they got the majority and they didn't always work with Jay Inslee either. But it'll be really interesting to see what goes on. Hard to predict what Bob Ferguson is going to do. He stays interesting.
Yeah, so let me ask the group then this question, because Bob Ferguson differentiated himself and became a sort of a, tier 2 level national figure at his perpetual lawsuits with the Trump administration. And, lo and behold, he's going to have to now deal with this administration on a variety of issues, being the governor of Washington State, with a state that had no hesitancy about suing the feds. How does this affect, and also it's a president who holds a grudge. How does this affect Washington State? Do you see it, Scott? Let's just start with you. How does this affect Washington's relationship with Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, the other Washington. I think they're certainly preparing for something to go down. The treasurer was trying desperately, the state treasurer was trying desperately to get the Biden administration to last minute rewrite some contracts so that if Trump cuts federal funding to Washington State.
Let's stop there for a minute. What sort of federal funding could be cut to Washington State?
It's hard to get into hypotheticals. The Democrats don't want to get into hypotheticals right now either. But in the last administration, we did see talks of cutting funding to anarchist jurisdictions like Seattle. Right, the Trump administration looked into that. Potentially university funding, and then he slow walked for months and months, according to reporting, national reporting. Slow walked requests for emergency fire aid in Washington State. Trump did, called Inslee a snake, things like that. So he does hold a grudge. I think we'll see what happens. I don't think Ferguson is very keen to. I think he wants to use it to his advantage to make a headline. I don't think he's keen to pick a fight. I think he realizes he has big issues at home. And a new job to figure out how to do. And a very boisterous legislature to figure out how to deal with,
Well, Washington did see less federal funding under the first Trump administration, less transit funding is my area of expertise, although Patty Murray was able to wrestle $1 billion out of the federal government when they took the legislature, the Congress for sound transit. But, I think we've seen how this administration and this regime, I guess I can call it, has treated states differently. We're seeing that in California right now.
Yeah, and frankly, Bob Ferguson utilized his lawsuits against the Trump administration to get elected governor. I mean, that's why he spent 4 years doing that, is to position himself to get elected governor. Now that he's elected governor, as you said, he's got a different job, and he's got to try to make nice, but that is not going to work because he still talks about his 100 lawsuits and how he only lost twice and all these great things that he did by suing the administration. That helps him none whatsoever in trying to work with the new administration. and he can try to talk a little bit less, but the first time that he has to go to the federal government asking for money, it's going to be a quid pro quo. That is the way that the Trump administration has worked in the past, and that is the way that he can probably expect for it to work in the future.
All right. We will be right back with Week in Review after a short break. Please stay tuned.
I'm Paul Henley, host of BBC NewsHour. Today we take the temperature in Ukraine as speculation mounts that a peace deal might be in the offing. The US TikTok ban is upheld, and news of what's been called ancient Pompeii's most exciting find in decades.
Those stories and much, much more today on BBC World Service News Hour, which begins at 1 o'clock right after Week in Review here on KUOW FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham. It's 12:48.
Support for KUOW comes from Third Place Books. Television host, guidebook author, and activist Rick Steves presents his new memoir, On the Hippie Trail, Istanbul to Kathmandu, and the Making of a Travel Writer, on February 25th at 7 p.m. Tickets available now at thirdplacebooks.com. And from Eco Design and Maintenance, family-owned and specializing in start-to-finish exterior design using materials and methods that help to reduce environmental impact. From landscapes to hardscaping, outdoor spaces designed to be functional and long-lasting. More at eco-seattle.com.
Welcome back to Week in Review. With us are KUOW's own Scott Greenstone, Ryan Packer, contributing editor with The Urbanist, and Randy Pepple, Republican strategist and media commentator. I'm Mike Lewis, in for Bill Radke. Here we get the chance to sort of revisit our past in Seattle, certainly my past as a reporter, because I haven't been a newspaper reporter since 2009 when the PI closed, and I was writing about this topic. This is... I for some reason, I kind of enjoy it because there really are a lot of difficult questions to answer here. This is about, since Greg Nichols' administration, he locked in zoning in the SoDo area and further south all the way to Georgetown, essentially as it is now, which is industrial, light commercial, and restricted any housing development. According to The Urbanist, a bill introduced in Seattle by Seattle Council President Sarah Nelson this week is set to reignite that debate over allowing housing in Seattle's industrial area and the future of the SoDo neighborhood. The industrial zone in question is west and south of T-Mobile and Lumen stadiums abutting the Port of Seattle. The Port of Seattle has expressed in the past strong opposition to any additional housing. They feel like it is that first breach of an area that they want to preserve as for business only. Ryan, what's the full discussion here?
Well, it's basically trying to restart a debate that we thought was settled in 2023. Like you mentioned, it's been happening a lot longer than that. But there was sort of a peaceful truce between labor groups and the port and housing advocates that basically had settled on no housing in SoDo. But Sarah Nelson apparently has a new coalition. She wants to restart this debate. I think it's very interesting that she's introducing this bill right now when we're ramping up discussion over the overall comprehensive plan, which is it's going to be a lot more housing than these 900 to 1,000 units, and so it's a little bit of a distraction in my view. But it's basically restarting this whole debate about whether industrial land should have people living on it.
Well, let me ask you just quickly about Sarah Nelson, council president. What is her incentive to bring this up now?
She thinks that it is, she's calling it an economic development bill. So she wants to encourage sort of new light industrial spaces in this area around the stadiums, which is kind of a little bit underutilized. And she says that that's only going to pencil if we allow housing to be built above it. I have some questions about that, especially considering that we're going to require the housing be affordable workforce housing. And so I'm not quite sure who's exactly making a profit in the situation. But, it's kind of a coalition of some affordable housing providers, the labor unions who are not the longshoremen, and sort of downtown groups who just love the idea of more activation.
I don't want to impugn Council President Sarah Nelson's or even sort of think out loud about what her motivations might be, but I will say she's looking at a re-election bid this year.
Right.
It's going to be tough. Labor is going to try and take her down. And if she could drive a wedge in between them, which this proposal absolutely does, the longshoremen do not want this housing here. The carpenters and the building trades do. If she can drive a wedge in that coalition, make it just a little bit weaker, win a couple friends on the labor front, she will, if I were a smart politician, that's what I would do.
Right. And obviously not to impugn anyone's motives in politics. Certainly their motives wouldn't be political.
They're always the highest motives.
always the highest motives. Randy, how do you see this one?
Did you say re-election campaign? Yes, we can impugn the motives of those people who are running for re-election. I mean, as a campaign consultant and someone who's run campaigns,
impugning is part of your job.
Well,
right?
That's their motive.
Right.
I mean, their motive is to get re-elected.
Right.
Okay, so this is no surprise. And she views this as a way, is it to drive a wedge with labor, or is it to show the business community that the city council can actually do something that's pro-business, if you will? And so she's proceeding down that path. From a policy standpoint, the bigger problem is if the state is going to erase all of your zoning and tell local governments you're not going to be in charge of zoning, and you've got to try to grab some pieces of zoning control back, that's what you leave the locals fighting over. Is this, we've got the state on one side trying to say everything is now a duplex or a quadplex. And you want to say, well, not on Queen Anne, it's not. And so we don't mind it down in SoDo. I mean, to me, it's almost diversionary than it is more serious.
I want to hear what Ryan thinks about that. But just to say, as far as business goes, this is a little bit of a wash. It's not necessarily in my mind, it's not necessarily a pro. Sure, the SoDo Neighborhood Association would like more people living in SoDo to go to their businesses, and Pioneer Square loves it too. They want more foot traffic. But the longshoremen and the port and a lot of those businesses that do trucking around there are not excited about having to deal with bicyclists.
Not at all.
Not at all. Bicyclists specifically. And the reason the longshoremen showed out in 2023 and were very, very strongly saying, do not do this, is because they don't want to run over the residents of those. They really don't want to chip away at industrial lands. That's what they're worried about.
Right? I think the diversionary aspect is really interesting to me because, like I said, we're having a very, very more broad conversation about the comp plan. To me, it's pretty cut and dry in terms of where should we be encouraging people to live in Seattle? Is the answer in neighborhoods with amenities like Maple Leaf, Madrona, Montlake, Tangletown, Columbia City, Admiral, or in an industrial area with very few amenities, no parks, that's also a liquefaction zone in the event of a large earthquake?
So to your point, though, what the city sees, at least as I understand it, is fairly downtown adjacent land, and I think that there is also some sort of maybe an idea that developer or wannabe developer Chris Hansen, who was trying to get an arena built on this exact land, if I remember correctly, that this is a way to sort of provide, since that land was going to be used for a large arena, that maybe it can be just sort of converted into some sort of mixed use housing with light industrial at the base. I mean, is this the type of thing that happened? Would it look more like, say, that area of Ballard, which is light industrial, or would it look like something different?
It would look pretty similar, I think, to that sort of part of Ballard. I think that part of Ballard was kind of sacrificed in this larger deal around industrial lands, which is sort of, you're already having the PCC pop up. I think that should have housing above it. Personally, that makes more sense to me. If you're going to have a PCC in industrial Ballard, not everyone drive to it. But basically, the deal was to leave SoDo alone. And I think there's a lot of slippery slope arguments happening here. Oh, if you can allow this to go further south, it's going to kind of creep into the neighborhood.
Right. So when we're talking about how is it hard? Let's just ask the group. Is it hard for a city council president or a city council member in Seattle right now to say anything that opposes additional housing and additional density in Seattle. Is that politically feasible given the nature of housing in Seattle and the expense of housing in Seattle?
Well, I've been hearing it from people like Kathy Moore, who say that density doesn't equal affordability, and so we should really be focused on affordability, which is antithetical to everything that the housing experts tell us.
Both business and labor, though, they want more housing. I think,
right.
There's a political
This is an interesting fight because of this.
It is an interesting one. Yeah.
All right, let's switch over really quickly to something that I put you all on task for, something that made you smile this week or perhaps even last week. Scott, we're starting with you.
All right. Two things. I host a politics podcast on this network called Sound Politics. I got to dive into a budget hole in the transportation budget this week. And the reason that made me smile.
You remember I said smile.
The reason that made me smile is, one, I'm a nerd. Two, I got to pretend I was a salmon. I dove into a stream because it turns out salmon culverts are one reason that our budget, like we've been talking about, is so in the red. And if you want to know more about that, listen to my podcast, Sound Politics. That was one thing that made me smile.
Fantastic, Ryan.
This morning, I came upon a building in Pioneer Square. It's called the Metropole Building. It's been boarded up for as long as I've lived in Seattle, but they just completed a years-long renovation on it. They graded the entire sidewalk, which has compartments under it because it's Pioneer Square, and so it's been unveiled. It looks gorgeous, and it's not boarded up anymore. It's a huge win for Pioneer Square. It made me smile.
That's fantastic. Randy?
Well, what made me smile was the death of Bob Uecker, and the Baseball Hall of Famer, not because he died, but because it just brought up all the memes and video clips of his greatest hits, from being on Johnny Carson to the Miller Lite commercials to being in Major League, and just what a fascinating man he was. Died at 90, in the Hall of Fame, not for his 200 batting average, but for his broadcasting ability. And just anytime you think about Bob Uecker, you got to smile in the front row.
All right, that is a wrap, folks. Thank you for joining us on Week in Review. Special thanks to our three panelists. Contributing editor Ryan Packer with the Urbanist. Thank you, Ryan. Republican strategist and media commentator Randy Pepple, and KUOW politics reporter, who you hear here all the time, and Sound Politics podcast, one of my favorite podcasts in Seattle, Scott Greenstone.
Thank you.
Week in Review is produced by Kevin Kniestead, Bernard Wallet. On the board, social media from Juan Pablo Chiquiza. Additional support from Hans Twite. I'm Mike Lewis in for Bill Radke. Bill will be back next week.
Support for KUOW comes from Arivity Financial.